Okay, it started.
Okay. By looking at the registered people, I think we were supposed to be like 30 and we are 12. So maybe we wait a couple of minutes and just I will use that to say, let's mark why we should maybe just, I mean, I already put some questions on the table. So if you might want to give your 1-2 questions that just needs to, 1-2 questions that just give the start.
Sure.
Just to start the discussion, yeah.
Were you asking that of me, Laura?
Yes, Mark, yes.
Okay, sure. I mean, it's great because, I mean, you address precisely a question that I raised in the document, and that is around addressing intersectionality in what in your question you called the automation of inequalities. And
right.
So here, I think just to be a little bit more specific about that, we can think about the ways in which all of us, you know, our personal data is generated, it's processed across multiple devices, and it's applied and impacts upon us in myriad domains. But of course, the impacts are highly differentiated. And if we think in terms of intersectional inequalities specifically, then that helps us to think about inequalities playing out through the interaction of multiple identities, experiences of exclusion, subordination, for example, very commonly around race, around gender, around class. You gave the example of the labor market, which is just one area. So I guess what I really was hoping to emphasize was to get us to think about the ways in which AI both reproduce existing kinds of intersectional inequalities, but also importantly exacerbate and augment and worsen them. And then just to get us to think about kind of both regulatory and technical elements that might help us to address this problem.
Great. So who wants to take the floor to address one of the many questions that Mona, Mark, myself, and also the other speaker, but especially, of course, our focus is on inequality. So any thought about how to think differently, how to come up with a different way of thinking about AI systems or designing them? From both social sciences, sociology, political sciences, philosophy, or even technical, if there are some of you that have more of a technical background. So yes, Mona, please. You have raised your hand. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, it's funny because I teach a lot virtually, and it's really nice to be in the student position for a change. So I want to ask can I just try something? If people are up for it, can I just maybe see by show of virtual hand who is at a university or in the academy? Okay, so that's a lot of, okay, great. Yeah, so the reason why I'm asking that, so that's okay, that's most of us. The reason why I'm asking that is because one of the things I've been thinking about and kind of struggling with, but also taking on over really a decade now of working on design inequality is the question how we can use university and the academy as a resource and as a place to push these questions and bring people together. And I mean literally use the resources, spaces for communities, crossing across disciplines. And I know that's very hard in the academy because interdisciplinary work actually is not very often rewarded and actually can create career bumps rather than, you know, actual improvements in your career progression. So I wonder if people have any concrete examples of using the university as a place maybe to start this work with us in the classroom or that's outside of the classroom, public education or anything. And Laura, I don't mean to steal away and feel free to ignore that. But I wonder if that would be a question to give it make that a bit more concrete.
I try to reframe in the meanwhile, I try to reframe one of the questions that I asked virtually before. It is about the mafia effect. So I think that differently, but many of us defined the mafia effect following its own or her own discipline. So in my case, the mafia effect is something that adds inequality to inequality to any other inequality. So being white and man and rich adds on, and with an output that is a sort of rich get richer effect. So on my side, the question would be how designing an AI system could contain this kind of mafia effect. But I'm sure that there are some of you that think about the mafia effect differently, more from a technical point of view or more from a physics point of view. So I put that on the table if there is anybody that wants to take this mafia effect and think it through it.
Maybe I can have a go.
Yeah, of course.
First, I have to apologize that I was in another meeting, so I didn't was able to participate or to listen to the fire start presentations, only to the last one by Mona. Thank you very much, Mona. It was very interesting. I was actually in a meeting with the law enforcement and investor funds working on using AI to combat online child exploitation. So there as well, this type of issues appeared on how the design of the tools enforces or supports behaviors, but also how can the design of the tools be done in a way that it can combat this type of very hard and very difficult misuses of online environments of AI, of all kinds of things. But that's not so much my my answer here. The issue of the meta effect, especially combining with the university question as Mona raised, is something which of course cannot start at university, at the level of university. If we don't start looking at inequalities much earlier in the kindergarten already, then when we achieve or get to the opportunity to deal with the inequalities or to deal with the efforts or design things at university level education, we are already too late. We cannot combat the lack of diversity at university or the lack of diversity in workforces by trying to change the university entry level or even later the master's or doctorate level or other higher levels of education. But it's something which really needs to start much earlier for diversity in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of background. It's really something which is much earlier. And I don't really have an answer in terms of how AI can or cannot be used there, but I think that it's definitely something which needs to be addressed from a much more broader multidisciplinary aspect. Technology alone cannot solve nothing. AI itself is not just a technology, but it's much more a product or a socio-technical ecosystem. So we really need to start to use many more disciplines and to involve many more disciplines, not only on the use of AI, but also on the addressing the need to start looking at education, to start looking at making a difference at a much lower or much earlier level than when people get to university or when we are dealing with the research that can be done at university. Don't know if it really answers anything, but it was just the thoughts I got while listening to both Mona and Laura now.
Yes, if Iftikhar. No, you were uploading, sorry, you didn't raise your hand, right? Yes.
He was applauding.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just recognized it too late.
I think I would like to support Virginia on the statement that she makes. And I think it actually connects back to what Sandy Penton said at the beginning, which is something that Virginia did not hear. It's a question. First of all, I'm not sure this is an AI problem, but this is a societal problem. And AI is not the answer for all the problems in society. And I think Alex Penton really put it nicely, saying instead of trying to reduce the impact of the hubs in the network, you might consider raising the importance of the leaves or those nodes that are actually not very connected in the network to a higher level, so they have more impact in the entire system. If I think about what Virginia was saying about education, in Belgium, education is open to everybody. There's no huge entry fee, which limits the possibilities that you have when entering an educational system. So coming back to this question about education and network and inequality. So by lowering this bar for everybody at the same level, you allow much more access to people and you remove inequality. But this has nothing to do with how AI can solve. These are political decisions that are made to say education should be open to everybody at a marginal cost, which is another discussion in my opinion. And AI will just reinforce, if you have the system in place and AI will use data from this kind of system, it will actually reinforce what's there instead of reinforcing the Matthew effect that you were mentioning in the beginning. I hope this makes sense. It's very abstract, cryptic response. Sorry.
I think you make very much sense, and indeed access to education is much easier in countries like Belgium or in many other European countries in which there is very low economical costs. But even in these countries, and I cannot talk for Belgium, but I can talk for the Netherlands and Sweden now, the differences are much subtle than that. Even if all children have the same opportunity to access education, and all schools, at least in both in the Netherlands and here in Sweden, follow a very similar curriculum from one to another, the differences are still quite substantial. And when advices are given to children from lower classes, to girls, to children from minorities, still we see across Europe a difference in terms of the advice that it's given. The girl, the low educated children from a lower social background will much more often get the advice, yeah, science is too much for you. Are you really sure that you want to follow a career in engineering or in physics or whatever? Maybe you should consider something else. And the white boy from the higher class will probably say, yeah, of course it's difficult, but I think you can do it. And this type of very subtle things, which have nothing to do with the economical access to education, it's what really needs to be combated and really needs to be addressed in the combating the Matthew effect. Maybe AI can be used there, maybe because AI might have a more blind overview of in giving this type of advice than the school teacher or the parents or whoever it is. So maybe we can profit or can use the opportunities that AI gives to be less aware of the context, exactly to give a more uniform type of advice in this case.
Yeah, I fully agree, Virginia, with that. Of course, there are much more subtleties than I was mentioning. This is fully true. I'm just always afraid that people see it in AI the solution for everything, which is a bit I'm trying to I'm a bit afraid of.
Sure.
Because it puts responsibility on our shoulders, which should not be there, in my opinion.
Exactly.
But I fully agree, but and indeed we have some work in the area of optimization, collective intelligence, where we see that using this kind of objective approaches actually leads to fairer outcomes. But the inverse we also see. I have some experiments where people do delegation to AI system in order to solve a coordination problem like climate change, trying to solve this problem. And we see that if delegate this responsibility to an AI system, we get much more success. But if you then go to the rewards, actually going to the people playing the game and delegating their decision making to these agents, actually see an increase in inequality. So even if success is improved, inequality is also increasing. Yeah. And this is not so much directly linked to Matthew effect kind of system. And we're not sure yet what the reason is. We have to explore it more deeply, but we see that on the one hand, the AI may help in being more successful in solving the problem, but at the same time, by solving the problem, it will increase the inequality between those actually you make use of the AI agent. So there's a lot of interesting questions that can also be asked in that respect. So that's more or less also why I'm here in this inequality panel at the moment. Maybe somebody else wants to add.
Yeah, now I'm probably getting too technical, but I wonder if maybe that's something to take out of this discussion. But I wonder if what the effect that you see has to do with this other effect that you cannot at the same time optimize for false positives and true positipositives.
That I would have to think about.
Yes, like I say, it's probably too technical and too much, but I had to think about this effect. The inequality comes exactly because you either are optimizing to optimize the correct answers, and that will at the same time create a worse false positives.
So in the experiment I was talking about, there's not really optimization because it's people deciding to pick a certain agent that behaves in a certain way to act on their behalf in a game. And so the good thing is that that the goal of the game is achieved much more easily. But it's then the side effects, which is not optimized for, of that achieving that goal, is that you have a bigger variation on the actions that the agents take to achieve that goal. Whereas if a human would play the game, you would be less successful, but there's more similar behavior between the humans playing that game.
Okay, so then it's different. But anyway, maybe it's an interesting thing to explore offline.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting for me too, but just to give a line to Tom, how do you choose the people to ask to? Because the point, I mean, I don't want the answer because probably we are leading the discussion in just only one direction. But I mean, when you select people, you have to take into consideration so many different aspects of them. And because that could be reflected in the choices that they make for you.
Fully agree. And that is coming back to your intersectional and to Marx and your intersectional thing. Of course, if we do these experiments, we are trying to, it's behavioral economics experiments. So we're really forcing a very narrow game where we incentivize certain kind of behavior, right? So there's not so it's not taking into account the entire spectrum of what they could do in different kind of contexts, which is fully what you're saying, and I agree with that.
Of course, but as Stuart was saying before, if you want to optimize, and please excuse me if I'm not using this word correctly, but if you want to optimize for gender, are you able to do it for race at the same time? This is just kind of a rhetorical question, just to spur the discussion, and I shut myself, but please go.
Multi-objective optimizations don't work in the same way as single objective optimization. So we would need to take other optimization criteria and also other optimization algorithms when we are trying to optimize for more than one criteria at the same time.
Yeah, I wonder, maybe I can just try to connect a couple of things that have been raised so far to see if we can expand our discussion. I mean, so I mean, Mona's, I've been really interested in what you've had to say about design. I like how you talked about design and making society. I also like the way that you talked about design and inequalities, both on a macro and a micro level. You talked about it in terms of superstructures and micro practices, which I think is extremely important. Other speakers, Stuart talked interestingly, and we've been just talking about optimization problems. Maybe one way to kind of summarize or to think generally about optimization problems is if an optimization problem utilizes bad data, then it's invariably going to create problems and perhaps greater inequalities. So maybe we might want to, and then subsequent to that, another way to think about, it's not the same, but it's a kind of a related technical dimension of, say, intersectionality, is thinking about heterogeneous machine agents, which Stuart also talked about, because then we can think about how they will operate both autonomously, but sometimes interacting interrelatedly. And then that forces us to think about data itself. And the data itself, I would argue, is one way in which we can link the technical dimensions with the kind of the lived experience of people in different communities, because and then that's also maybe a way to think about addressing inequality in terms of empowerment or increasing agency of people. And that kind of made me think a little bit about what Sandy said at the very beginning about data cooperatives. So I guess there's two kind of just themes maybe that I could try to pull out of those many observations. And one is to think about equality in relation to data, and data specifically as it relates to the control or lack of control that we have, or understanding of the data that we generate. But then also to come back to Mona's question about the university, to think about interdisciplinarity. I mean, I think we're seeing some evidence of interdisciplinarity right here in this room, but that kind of ongoing challenge.
Mona first and then Francesca.
Thank you, Laura. And thanks so much for all the points that have been made so far. I just want to take the optimization discussion as a cue and just ask, in the spirit of thinking about the interconnectedness between micro and macro structures and practices, if we're saying we're optimizing problem solving, whose problem are we actually solving? Like, who defines what's the problem? One, what exactly are we optimizing? And what's the bigger socio-political context for that? Let's take law enforcement, and let's take the fact that we see inequities in the way in which people with darker skin tones do not get recognized by things like facial recognition technology. Alondra Nelson, who's an eminent STS scholar now in the White House, has said very early on, or has asked very early on, do we actually want to optimize the surveillance of communities that have traditional or have historically been oppressed and over surveilled? Is that something we want to do? Is that actually the kind of optimization we want to see? And I'm fearful that if we focus on optimization only and optimizing the optimization, we totally lose track of sort of the bigger backdrop and the question, okay, what is the problem? Who defines the problem? And do we actually need AI for this? And just today, the state of Maine, for example, passed another very aggressive legislation against facial recognition technologies. So we're seeing huge movement in that space. That's one thing I wanted to say. The other thing I wanted to say about meaning is I absolutely agree. I think data is so important, but I think we need to perhaps maybe include a view for the process of data collection. And you can see that very clearly when you look at health data, for example. What is used in precision medicine, for example, is electronic health records that can be notes of doctors, for example. Though that kind of data is not necessarily created for the purpose of developing a precision medicine tool. So that might not actually carry the appropriate meaning for that tool. So when we think about AI and the sort of dual use problem and using one model for the other and using one data set for another context, I think we need to be mindful of that. And then the last thing I want to say before I shut up is what I meant by universities is literally, it didn't mean necessarily, or first and foremost, how can we get more people into the university? What I meant by that is how can we as academics who have or can have fairly stable jobs. I know that, I mean, I'm also the precarious underclass, but that, you know, some have actually a lot of power. How can we change the academy so that actually we take the resources that we have at our disposal to, for example, engage local communities more? How can we literally open the doors and become more active in sort of policy making processes that can be very local? And I think that's important in the context of AI, because legislation or regulation of artificial intelligence systems in the context of particular use cases is very local. We see this in New York City, and we see this in other places around the world, but you know, local agencies, cities make moves very fast. I'm gonna end here. Thank you.
Thanks, Mona. Francesca?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, and then Virginia,
Okay.
please go.
I would like to point out something which is very related to me. I am a PhD student in data science. I am a physicist, and I'm working on artificial intelligence applied to medicine, in particular to medical images analysis. And I want to say something. The first thing is that I do not believe that science is neutral, as somebody told before, especially applied science. I think that this pandemic underlined in some ways how much is important to discuss ethical issues of applying artificial intelligence to, in my case, to medicine. As regard the academic debate, I think that for my experience, it is important just to discuss about this thing, because in my research group, which is made by physicists, and I'm a physicist, we do not discuss at all of these kind of problems, which are problems, and they are not only, in my opinion, related to social sciences, but they are also scientific problems. And I want to underline one precise thing, which is in our domain, in medical images domain, there is a very big lack of data sets. We work with very small data sets. I have developed an algorithm based on deep learning with 200 patients, for example. On the other hand, we read many papers, many studies made by companies, great companies, that are made with 10,000s, sometimes millions of cases. I think this is something which is related to inequality in making science and in producing knowledge. Another issues that I link to inequality is accessing to data, in the sense that in Italy, especially in Italy, we have many problems in accessing hospital data, because the process to obtain data is very long and it is very hard to keep on. And many times we, as academic, are not able to manage the process. We are physicists in my experience, in my group, and I think we should need lawyers, for example, in order to manage all the legal problems related to, for example, privacy. On the other hand, we can choose to use only public data, but public data have many problems. For example, they have not information about social specificities. Public data are published without gender, without provenance, data provenance. In the specific case of medical images, each image is made by a manufacturer, and we do not have this information, and this may bias strongly our algorithm. And it also does not allow fair comparison, in my opinion, to algorithms applied in clinical practice. As last thing, I want to say that I think that it is important to discuss of micro practices, but I think that it is also important to discuss the macro practices, because I think that if we are here to discuss, it's because micro practices are not sufficient to tackle the problem. I think, especially in the medical domain, but I think in every domain in which algorithms are then used in the society, that we should go toward global responsibility on data. On the other hand, using this huge amount of data to develop algorithms and then to apply them on the society as an important drawback, in my opinion, and it is that we lose details. Using many data to train algorithm can cause, on the other hand, the fact that we are not in control of our system. We cannot establish in a scientific way the boundaries on which this algorithm works. So thank you for the discussion. This is my point.
Thanks, Francesca. Virginia, it's up to you.
Oh, now there are increasingly more things to react on, but let me see, I will pick a few. Starting with the law enforcement and what Mona was raising in terms, do we want to keep surveilling those who have been typically more surveilled, and those ones who have been more surveilled or more disadvantaged? It's indeed an issue. It's an issue which, in a sense, relates to the broader sense of the optimization, of the sense of improving on one thing or another, and all design is about improvement on one criteria or another, and it is also very much related to risk. And in this, going back to the surveillance, the decisions or the improvement is in terms of, do we want to ensure that we, let's say, catch as many criminals as possible, taking into the risk that we might catch or identify potentially ones who are not criminal as being criminal. That's one extreme. The other extreme is, do we want to ensure that we treat everybody as much fair as possible, so not doubting or suspecting unduly anyone, but with the risk that we might lose on some criminals, let's say, in the process. So how much risk we want and where we put the risk has a lot to do on the design criteria or the improvement criteria on the societies that we design. And some societies, some political policy designing tends more to one side or to the other side, and the criminal example is just one example, but in many other issues it's the same. We see now with decisions concerning the order in which people get vaccinated or not for the COVID, we see that in issues in terms of where do we put finance or support at local government level, all these type of issues. There is a risk there, but there is also a balance between where do we want to fail and where do we want to be sure that we don't fail at all or don't have any risk at all. So those are issues, and increasingly decisions are being made to minimize the risk at all costs, even if that means that we are creating extra problems or extra surveillance for those ones or those issues where there would be no risk or a limited risk. Going back to the issue of the education and open up the universities, Yes, I think that's a very important thing to start discussing and to see how we can do that. But again, there I think that it involves much more than just the university education. And actually, if we look at how our education systems are at this moment, they are exactly the same or very similar to the education which we had 200 years ago. We have the same disciplines, we have the same type of steps. We start education at, I don't know, a year 6, depending on the country where you are. We educate people between the ages of 6 and 20, and after that we expect that they are educated forever. So again, there in the opening of the university, I think that it really needs to go together with a rethinking of the whole education system. The way that society and the technology evolves means that we cannot expect that the education that someone received by the time that they were 20 years old or 25 or whatever is sufficient to keep them for the rest of their lives aligned and pair with the technology developments that are happening. And at the same time, probably we can benefit, younger generations can benefit from a more interactive or interlived education and work or education and other types of social intervention and social action. So opening the universities also, I think it means that also we need to open the way that we educate at many different levels, continuous education and that kind of lifelong learning issues also need to be taken into account as ways to combat inequality.
Maybe can I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
To Mona, actually, because she mentioned this issue of interdisciplinarity. I was not sure how you link that back to the inequality discussion here.
So I think when we, through the notion of expertise. So when we think about who is an expert in what, and we think about that from the, as being within the academy, we think about that along the lines of certain disciplines. I'm a sociologist, Laura's a sociologist, Virginia's a technologist, and Francesca's a data scientist and a physician. So like we're in these boxes. So one thing we can do to level the playing field and think about who's actually an expert in the domains that are important for more equitable design, we can start here and say, well, actually, in order to think about that holistically and sustainably, we need to create we need to get rid of the hierarchies of expertise that are within the academy. And that method would then allow us to take this even a step further and say, well, actually, while we're at it, on doing that expertise hierarchy, we may also think about people who have lived experience with, through being affected by these technologies as experts too. The people who are, these systems get deployed at, sometimes without asking. Many populations come to mind. One population is, for example, my students who are, they're graduating with a bachelor's degree, they're entry level, they're all going through these hiring softwares. They are not, giving consent is meaningless. And so what we can do, for example, is bring in their expertise when we talk about addressing inequalities as it materializes in these systems. But I think it's a method, if that makes sense.
That makes sense completely. Thank you.
If I can just quickly follow up, Mon, I think that I really like the way that you're talking about interdisciplinarity in relation to expertise, because I think it's also another way for us to perhaps frame a much more holistic understanding of what are the things that we need to attend to when we talk about inequality in relation to AI. Because on the one hand, if we're talking about technical expertise, then we might be talking about a very specific optimization problem, which demands a very specific understanding, which is difficult for people to understand. So, you know, it's hard for the general community to say, have any sense of what the difference between a kind of a connectionist or symbolic AI paradigm might be, and how that relates to the different kind of data that we generate and the ways in which it's processed by a neural network or not. But then when you talk about expertise and we think about data, then we can come back directly into communities, into lived experience. And then that allows us to see the kind of the very differential sort of socio-cultural lived experience that people have. And then that helps us to think about how those broader structures, power structures, always feed into the kinds of data sets that get generated, and then to keep this simple and focused and go back to that kind of optimization problem. So I think the one thing to try to bring this all back together with interdisciplinarity is to think about kind of how we develop kind of translation points. I think Jennifer Pybus was a part of this talk, and I know she did a recent research project on talking about zones of data translation, where the idea is to try to bring in or learn from communities around their kind of expertise of their data, but also in relation to the technical processes whereby it gets applied back to them. And that's a kind of ongoing problem.
Okay, I see Jennifer that raised her hand, and then Yonne. So I think like you have 1 minute each, because we have to go back to the plenary in a couple of minutes.
We're supposed to go back to the plenary at 10. Did not Dino say that we go till 10 past the hour?
10 past?
I think it was 5 past.
Or 5 past. So we still have more time.
Okay, 5 past. Sorry. Yes.
Just you know, we need also 5-10 minutes to wrap up what we have said.
Okay, so let's say at 6 o'clock we shut down the breakout room. Okay, thanks, Jennifer.
Okay, I will be very brief then. And Mark mentioned actually what I wanted to emphasize anyways, but just to respond to what Mona was saying, that, you know, that there's kind of leverage with experts when you're kind of thinking about this interdisciplinary work. But the question then is, how do you use experts to build these bridges of translation back to people who are directly being impacted by these technologies? So, you know, when we think about GDPR, we have, you know, privacy by design, but this is still a very kind of top-down way of thinking about design. Whereas if we can take a more grounded perspective, like privacy by our design, then we can think more about how experts can, you know, help to break elements down, which is what we were doing in our research, where we were kind of bringing tools that anyone with no technical abilities could use to open up their mobile devices to think about kind of pathways of data, so that they could kind of think about different ways of what consent means based on what they were seeing inside the application. So it's like, how do we kind of bring those expert leverage that kind of expert capacity, bringing this into community and then folding it back into our research. So there's this kind of constant relationality between community and researcher.
Thanks. Yonne, if I pronounce it correctly, please.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, so thanks for all the nice input, and thank you, Laura and Mona, for the really interesting firestarters. So I actually also want to add something to Mona when, yeah, so I'm working on responsible AI development. I'm a PhD candidate at TU Delft. And I'm very much interested in the power relations between those that shape the systems and those that are affected by the system. So I think it's a really, really interesting idea to sort of bringing the lived experience into the design process. But what I always sort of keep running into is, where during the design process do you do this? Because as was mentioned, also already, is that there is this technical expertise that is necessary. Yet still, the technical expertise also involves value judgments and like normative and epistemic consequences. But you cannot have everyone being involved in the design process, and you also don't want everyone involved. So I'm kind of curious, like what you mean exactly when you talk about bringing in the lived experiences in the design. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question, and I'm glad to hear that you're at TU Delft. Do you know Roel, who used to be at AI now?
Oh, Doma?
Roundtable, yes, we know.
Yes.
It. Yeah.
Hi, say hi. So that's a very important question, and I think the way in which this can be translated into a more applied space is returning to the problem of the problem. Namely, what is the problem, defining very clearly what is the problem you are trying to solve, who participates in that, and whose problem is it? And I'm just going to put into the chat a video of this was at the FACT conference in 2020, just before we all shut down. This is research presented by an interdisciplinary team who collaborated on designing an sepsis detection tool. I think it was at Duke University Hospital. And they're really focused on developing such a tool, not generally, but for the emergency room, and use the problem as a framing device to decide who should be participating in what way in order to solve that particular problem. So I think it is useful to deploy the problem as a frame, to then decide who comes in at what point, and also to decide when do you iterate, right? Like, and when do you kind of stop iteration and say, well, this is kind of ready for deployment now, and then we have kind of all the work that comes with maintenance and all of that stuff, which is a fairly well-trodden path in science and technology studies, for example. Does that make sense as a response to that?
Yeah, just it's very contextual always, basically, I guess.
Which is interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
More like there's just not a general solution that you can really apply in order to, yeah, legitimize perhaps the design or the use, I guess.
Yeah, which I think where it also kind of clashes with some of the aspiration and logics of, capital A, capital I, in the sense that this is essentially a scaling technology, right? That's what we're after. We're after large scale optimization, which,
yeah,
that's an interesting tension space.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so we are perfectly on time, and I think we should stop here, and then with Mark and Luca, we are just wrapping up what we have been discussing, and we see you in 10 minutes, if I remember correctly, on the plenary.